You might think life is set in stone when you're in your mid-50s. I certainly did. I thought I knew where I stood as a wife, a stepmother, and a woman. But life has a way of throwing surprises at you. Ones you never see coming. Ones you can never prepare for. My name is Eleanor, though most call me Ellie. I've been married to Richard for 15 years, and I've raised his son, Damien, since he was a teenager. Damien. Even now, saying his name makes me pause. He's 26 now, tall, confident, with sharp features and a presence that fills any room. I was proud of the man he'd become, but that day at the mall changed everything. It started with a simple favor. Damien needed a few new suits for work, and Richard was out of town as usual. "Why don't you come with me?" I'd suggested. "I know what looks good on you." I hadn't meant anything by it at the time, but looking back, maybe some part of me knew. The mall was unusually lively for a weekday afternoon, its wide halls humming with chatter and the occasional laugh echoing off polished floors. I'd expected a quieter outing, something simple and quick. But as we stepped into the upscale boutique, Damien at my side, I could tell this was going to be more of an adventure than I'd planned. Damien scanned the racks with a practiced, indifferent air, his hands sliding over the neatly arranged suits. He had a knack for looking composed no matter the situation, a trait that sometimes unnerved me. He carried himself like someone older than his 26 years, and lately I'd found myself noticing it more than I should. "I don't even know where to start," he said, glancing at me with a wry smile. "That's what I'm here for," I replied, stepping ahead of him. "You'd end up in the same black suit you already own if I let you shop alone." He chuckled softly. "Isn't black supposed to be timeless?" "Timeless, yes. Interesting, no." I pulled a deep blue jacket off the rack and held it up to him. "Try this." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, draping the jacket over his arm. I knew Damien trusted my judgment. He always had, even when he was a moody teenager, reluctantly letting me help him pick out school clothes. Back then, I'd been the patient, pragmatic stepmom, the one who smoothed out the rough edges in his relationship with his father. But now, things felt different. Damien disappeared into a fitting room while I continued browsing, pulling a few more options from the racks. When I returned to the dressing area, the attendant looked flustered, juggling a stack of clothes while gesturing toward a line of occupied rooms. "Sorry, ma'am," she said. "We're completely full. It might be a few minutes." "That's fine," I replied, glancing toward Damien's stall. "I'm just bringing these to my—" I paused. "To my son." The word felt strange on my tongue, even though I'd said it 100 times before. I knocked lightly on his door. "Damien, I've got a couple more for you." The door cracked open, and his face appeared. Perfect timing. I was about to come out anyway. He stepped back to let me in, taking the hangers from my hand. "Ellie, you don't have to." "It's crowded," I interrupted, brushing past him. "And I'm not standing out there like a pack mule while you take your time." The space was tight, barely enough room for the two of us to maneuver around each other. Damien shrugged, unbothered, and turned his back to me as he slipped out of his shirt. I tried not to look, keeping my focus on the rack of clothes in front of me, but the mirror betrayed me. His reflection caught my attention, unguarded and sharp. His shoulders, broad and well-defined, tensed slightly as he slid the jacket on. The fabric fit him perfectly, hugging his frame in a way that was both professional and undeniably striking. "Well?" he asked, turning to face me. I snapped out of my thoughts, stepping forward to adjust the lapels. "It's good. A little snug in the shoulders, though." My voice came out steadier than I felt. Damien smiled, watching me as I smoothed the fabric. "You've got an eye for this stuff. No wonder Dad lets you pick out all his clothes." I froze for half a second at the mention of Richard. He'd been gone for weeks now, buried in another endless business trip. I pushed the thought aside and took a step back, avoiding Damien's gaze. "Try the blue one next," I said quickly, reaching for the hanger. He unbuttoned the jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The air in the tiny room felt heavier somehow, and I realized too late that I was still standing directly in his way. "Ellie," he said, his voice softer now. "Yes." "You don't have to stay in here. I can manage." I should have left then. I knew it. But instead I smiled, a weak attempt to cover the awkwardness. "Someone has to make sure you don't look ridiculous." He laughed quietly. the sound low and rich. Then he stepped closer, brushing past me as he reached for the next jacket. The faintest hint of cologne lingered in the air between us, and for a moment, the noise outside the stall seemed to fade away. "Blue, huh?" he said, breaking the silence. "You sure about this one?" "It'll bring out your eyes," I said, immediately regretting how personal it sounded. Damien held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he slipped the jacket on, turning to face the mirror. "What do you think?" I forced myself to focus, stepping closer to adjust the cuffs. "It's good, really good." He looked at me then, not in the mirror but directly, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I never thanked you for everything you've done for me." "Damien." "I mean it," he continued. "You've always been there for me, more than my own mom ever was. And now, here you are, still taking care of me." His words sent a ripple through me, equal parts warmth and unease. I managed a weak smile. That's what family's for. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt smaller than ever, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Then, as if on cue, a sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. "Everything okay in there?" the attendant called. I stepped back quickly, my cheeks burning. "Yes, we're fine," I said, my voice too bright. Damien smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "Guess we should wrap this up," he said, shrugging out of the jacket. "Right," I muttered, reaching for the hangers. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered the clothes. But I hoped he didn't notice. We left the fitting room a few minutes later, the tension still lingering like a shadow between us. As we made our way to the register, Damien walked a step closer than usual, his shoulder brushing mine. I told myself it was nothing, a simple coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The drive home from the mall was unusually quiet. Damien sat beside me, his arm resting casually on the door, his eyes focused on the passing scenery. The rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt should have been soothing, but instead, it left too much space for my thoughts to spiral. I tried to push aside the nagging weight of what had happened in the dressing room. Nothing really happened, I reminded myself. It was just a fleeting moment, one that meant more in my head than it had in reality. But no matter how I spun it, I couldn't shake the image of Damien's face, the way his eyes had held mine in that impossibly small space. "Ellie?" His voice jolted me, and I gripped the wheel tighter, clearing my throat. "Yes?" "You're awfully quiet. Usually you can't stop giving me grief about my driving when we're in the car." I forced a chuckle. "Maybe I'm just tired of fighting a losing battle." He smiled, that easy, disarming grin of his, and leaned back in his seat. "You know, I really do appreciate you coming with me today. I probably would have ended up with something boring if I'd gone alone." "You're welcome," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "I've got a reputation to uphold, after all. Can't have my stepson looking like he walked out of a thrift store." The light-hearted banter helped, but only for a moment. As we pulled into the driveway, the weight of home settled over me. Richard wouldn't be back until next week, which meant the house would be quiet, too quiet, for the next several days. I turned off the engine and glanced at Damien. "You can leave the bags in the car for now. I'll deal with them later." "Sure," he said, stepping out. I watched him for a moment as he stretched, the afternoon sun catching the sharp lines of his jaw and the hint of a smirk still playing on his lips. Then I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. Inside, the house felt cooler, the faint hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. Damien headed upstairs, his footsteps echoing faintly on the wooden stairs. I busied myself in the kitchen, unloading groceries we'd picked up on the way home. It was a mindless task, exactly what I needed to settle my thoughts. But even as I arranged the fridge shelves and folded plastic bags, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in the dressing room. His voice, his closeness, the way my heart had betrayed me by pounding too hard, too fast. "Ellie?" I jumped, spinning around to find Damien leaning against the doorframe. His hair still damp from a quick shower. He'd changed into a simple t-shirt and jeans, but somehow he made even that look effortless. "You scared me," I said, laughing nervously. "Sorry," he said, though his smile suggested otherwise. "I was just wondering if you wanted to watch something later, a movie or whatever." It was such a simple request, but the casual intimacy of it caught me off guard. We'd spent time together like this before, of course, plenty of lazy evenings in front of the TV, but now, everything felt different. "Sure," I said finally. "Let me just finish up here." That evening, the two of us settled into the living room. Damien lounged on the couch, his long legs stretched out, while I curled up in the armchair with a glass of wine. He'd picked some action movie I'd never heard of, though I wasn't paying much attention to the plot. I told myself I was imagining things when he glanced my way more than usual, or when he shifted closer on the couch, leaving less space between us than before. Maybe I was just reading too much into everything, letting my guilt distort reality. But then he spoke, his voice soft enough to make me strain to hear him over the movie. "Ellie, can I ask you something?" I looked up, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Of course." He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the screen before returning to me. "Earlier, at the mall, was everything okay?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Why wouldn't it be?" I said too quickly. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, you just seemed different, like something was bothering you." I laughed, a brittle sound that didn't quite reach my eyes. "I think you're imagining things." "Maybe," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe me. The air between us grew heavier, the room seeming smaller somehow. I felt his gaze linger on me, warm and searching, and I forced myself to focus on the screen, pretending to care about the explosions and gunfire. After a few minutes, Damien shifted again, this time leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. "You've always been there for me, Ellie," he said quietly. "More than anyone else. I hope you know how much that means to me." The sincerity in his voice sent a pang through me, and I set my glass down carefully, afraid my shaking hands might betray me. "I'm just doing what any parent would do," I said, keeping my tone light. "Not every parent," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him then, unable to stop myself. His face was shadowed in the dim light, but his eyes were bright, steady, and too knowing. "I mean it," he said. "You've always been more than just my stepmom. You've always made me feel like I mattered." My heart twisted at his words, and for a moment I couldn't find my voice. When I finally spoke, it came out softer than I intended. "You do matter, Damien. You always have." The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid, a fragile tension that neither of us dared to break. Finally, I stood, clearing my throat. "It's late," I said, avoiding his gaze. "We should both get some sleep." Damien nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Ellie." "Good night." I turned and left the room, my steps quick and deliberate. But as I climbed the stairs and shut the door behind me, I couldn't stop the flurry of emotions that swept over me. Guilt, confusion, and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding in the quiet darkness. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't something I could ignore. Not anymore. The days that followed were a quiet storm, filled with charged moments that never quite spilled over but left a trail of tension in their wake. Damien and I danced around each other in the house, our interactions polite on the surface, but underpinned with something I couldn't name or didn't want to. Richard called once during the week, his voice distant and rushed as usual. "Everything all right at home?" he asked, and I assured him it was. I didn't mention the way Damien lingered in the kitchen when I cooked, offering to help with things he'd never cared about before. I didn't tell him how I'd catch him watching me from across the room, his gaze steady and unflinching, or how I'd started wearing sweaters around the house to hide the heat that rose under his attention. I told myself it was nothing, a phase, some passing, whatever it was. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, about a week after the mall trip, Damien found me in the backyard, tending to the small herb garden I'd planted years ago. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and the air smelled faintly of basil and lavender. "You spend a lot of time out here," he said, stepping onto the patio. "It's peaceful," I replied without looking up. My hands were buried in the soil, the cool earth grounding me in a way nothing else could. He crouched beside me, his presence a solid weight in the soft twilight. "I never really got it before," he said, his voice low, "why you cared so much about this garden. But now—" He trailed off, running a hand over the leaves of a rosemary plant. I glanced at him, my heart catching at the way the fading light softened his features. Now what? He smiled faintly. Now I think I understand. It's about having something that's yours, something you can nurture, even when everything else feels chaotic. I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I focused on the soil, patting it down with more force than necessary. You've been quiet lately, he said after a moment. Have I? I asked, though we both knew the answer. Yeah. I miss when you tell me off for leaving my shoes by the door, or complain about how I never fold the laundry right. I laughed despite myself, shaking my head. Maybe I'm just tired of nagging. Or maybe you're tired of pretending. The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken for far too long. I froze, my hands stilling in the dirt. Damien. It's okay, he said quickly, his voice gentle. You don't have to say anything. I wanted you to know that I notice. That I'm here. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I pulled back sharply, rising to my feet. I should finish up here, I said, my voice too bright, too forced. It's getting dark. Damien stood as well, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't press me, didn't try to stop me as I gathered my tools and hurried inside. But the weight of his gaze followed me, lingering long after I'd shut the door behind me. Later that week, the annual neighborhood barbecue rolled around. A loud, boisterous event hosted by the Johnsons down the street. Richard and I had attended every year since we moved into the neighborhood, but with him away, I debated skipping it altogether. You should go, Damien said over breakfast that morning. You've been cooped up in the house all week. And what about you? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I'll come with you, he said, surprising me. It'll be nice to get out for a bit. That evening, we arrived at the barbecue together, the two of us navigating the crowd with practiced ease. The smell of grilled meat and the sound of laughter filled the air, and for a while, I managed to forget everything else. But as the evening wore on, I became increasingly aware of Damien's presence, how he stayed close to me, his arm brushing against mine as we moved through the yard, the way he seemed to shield me from the boisterous crowd without saying a word. At one point, Susan, my closest friend in the neighborhood, sidled up to me with a knowing smile. Well, look at you, she teased, nodding toward Damien. You've got yourself quite the bodyguard tonight. I laughed nervously, brushing off her comment. He's just being polite. Polite? Please. Half the women here are swooning and he hasn't taken his eyes off you all night. I forced a smile, though her words sent a flush of heat creeping up my neck. You're imagining things. Susan shrugged, sipping her wine. If you say so. By the time we returned home, the weight of the day had settled over me like a heavy blanket. Damien and I barely spoke as we walked inside, both of us lost in our thoughts. Thanks for coming with me, I said finally, breaking the silence. Anytime, he replied, his voice soft. I turned to head upstairs, but his voice stopped me. Ellie. I looked back, my heart pounding. He was standing in the doorway, the dim light casting shadows across his face. Yeah? He hesitated, his expression unreadable. Good night? Good night, I said, though the word felt inadequate, too small for everything unspoken between us. I climbed the stairs slowly, my steps heavy. But when I reached my room and shut the door behind me, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't undo. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to see where it would lead. The sound of Richard's voice on the phone was the first sign that everything could fall apart. It was late afternoon, and I was in the living room with Damien. He was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a magazine, while I sat nearby with a cup of tea. The house felt calm, the kind of comfortable quiet I'd come to savor in Richard's absence. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it was him. His calls were always abrupt, unannounced, and timed just well enough to remind me of his presence, fleeting but ever looming. Hi, Richard, I said, forcing my voice into a cheerful lilt as I answered. Ellie, good news, he said without preamble. The conference wrapped up early. I'm flying back tonight. I froze, my breath catching. Tonight? I thought you weren't coming back until Friday. There's no point in staying if everything's done. I'll be home by 10. Don't wait up. The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as though it might explain why my carefully constructed world was suddenly unraveling. Damien's voice broke the silence. "He's coming back, isn't he?" I looked at him, startled. "How did you?" "I could tell from your face," he said simply, sitting up. "Yes," I said, setting the phone down with trembling fingers. "He'll be here tonight." Damien leaned back against the cushions, his expression unreadable. "You don't seem thrilled." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's just unexpected. I wasn't prepared." "Neither was I," he murmured, his gaze steady on mine. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and undeniable. I looked away, focusing on my tea, as if the swirling liquid might somehow provide clarity. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of half-hearted tidying and restless pacing. I told myself I was just cleaning for Richard's arrival, but I couldn't ignore the tension coiling tighter with each passing hour. Damien disappeared upstairs after dinner, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the ever-ticking clock. By the time Richard's car pulled into the driveway, my nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. I stood in the hallway, smoothing down my blouse, as the front door opened and he stepped inside. "Ellie," he said, setting down his briefcase, "you didn't have to wait up." "I couldn't sleep," I lied, forcing a smile. Richard looked older than I remembered, his features lined with exhaustion. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, the gesture mechanical and devoid of warmth. "Where's Damien?" he asked, glancing around the house. "Upstairs, I think," I replied. "He went to bed early." Richard nodded absently, already heading toward the kitchen. "I'll grab a drink and head to bed myself. We'll catch up tomorrow." "Of course," I said, relief flooding through me. But as I watched him disappear down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around me were closing in. The real test came the next morning. Richard was up early, seated at the breakfast table with a mug of coffee and the newspaper. I moved around the kitchen, preparing his usual toast and eggs, while Damien lingered by the counter with his own cup of coffee. The tension was unbearable. Every glance, every movement felt magnified, as though Richard might somehow sense the invisible thread that now connected Damien and me. "So, what's new around here?" Richard asked, glancing between us. "Not much," I said quickly, setting his plate in front of him. "Just the usual." He sipped his coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Damien, have you been keeping your mother company while I've been gone?" The casual way he said "mother" made my stomach twist, though Damien remained unfazed. "Of course," he said smoothly, his tone light. "We went shopping, had a barbecue with the neighbors. Nothing too exciting." Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I could feel Damien's gaze on me, a silent reminder of the secrets we now shared. It wasn't until later that afternoon that things nearly unraveled entirely. Richard had left for the office to catch up on work, leaving me and Damien alone in the house once more. I thought I'd finally have a moment to breathe, but fate had other plans. I was in the laundry room, sorting clothes, when I heard Richard's voice from the front hall. "Ellie?" I forgot my keys. My blood ran cold. I hadn't even heard the door open. "Coming," I called, my voice trembling as I dropped the clothes and rushed toward the sound. I rounded the corner to find him standing by the coat rack, rifling through his briefcase. Damien appeared at the top of the stairs just as I reached the hall, his expression calm but his posture tense. "I thought you were at work," I said, forcing a laugh as I handed Richard his keys from the counter. "I was halfway there when I realized I left these," he said, holding them up. "Good thing I wasn't far." His gaze shifted to Damien, who was leaning casually against the banister now, his arms crossed. "What were you up to?" Richard asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just heading out," Damien said easily. "I've got some errands to run." Richard nodded, though his expression lingered on Damien a moment too long before he turned back to me. "You've been keeping busy, I see." "Always," I said with a brittle smile. He kissed my cheek again, then headed out the door without another word. As soon as the sound of his car faded, I exhaled sharply, leaning against the counter for support. "That was close," I muttered. Damien descended the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. "Too close," he agreed, his voice low. I looked up at him, my heart still racing. "Damien, we can't." "We'll be careful," he interrupted, his tone steady. "But I'm not walking away from this." His words sent a shiver through me, equal parts fear and something far more dangerous. I don't know if we can keep this up, I whispered, more to myself than to him. We will, he said simply, because we don't have a choice anymore. His confidence should have scared me, should have made me run, but instead it anchored me, pulling me deeper into a web I couldn't escape. And as I stood there, my pulse still pounding in my ears, I realized he was right. The weight of secrets has a way of changing the air around you. It turns something as ordinary as a glance or a passing touch into a loaded gesture, every moment fraught with possibility and risk. I'd grown used to this over the past weeks, to the constant balancing act of maintaining appearances while navigating the turbulent undercurrent of my feelings. But nothing prepared me for the storm that night. It started innocently enough. Richard was working late again, locked away in his home office, the faint sound of his keyboard clacking through the closed door. Damien and I were in the living room, the television flickering in the background as we sat in companionable silence. At least it seemed like silence on the surface. In reality, the room was brimming with everything we weren't saying. I stole a glance at him from the corner of my eye. He was seated on the far end of the couch, his posture relaxed but his attention clearly elsewhere. The way he held himself, confident, unbothered, only made the knot in my chest tighten. "Ellie," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. I looked at him, startled. "Yes?" He hesitated, his expression shifting to something softer, more vulnerable. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Why would you ask that?" I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Because I've been watching you," he replied, "and I don't think you are." I stared at him, my heart pounding. There it was again, the quiet, unshakable way he saw through me, as if he could peel back every layer of pretense I'd spent years constructing. "Damien," I trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, shifting closer. "Maybe you're just too afraid to admit it." The sound of Richard's office chair scraping across the floor startled both of us. I stood abruptly, smoothing down my blouse as if the motion could somehow erase the moment we'd just shared. "I should, Ellie." Damien's voice was firm, steady, cutting through my excuses like a knife. I turned to face him, my heart racing. But before either of us could say anything more, Richard's voice called out from the hallway. "Ellie, where's the file I left on the counter?" "It's in the kitchen," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. Richard appeared a moment later, his brow furrowed in that way that made him look perpetually distracted. He didn't even glance at Damien as he retrieved the file and disappeared back into his office, the door closing with a muted thud. I exhaled slowly, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Damien stood, his movements deliberate, and crossed the room to stand in front of me. "You can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "Doing what?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. "Pretending," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You deserve more than this, Ellie. You deserve to be happy." The sincerity in his voice broke something in me, and for a moment, I let myself believe him. I let myself imagine a life where things were different, where I wasn't bound by obligations and the weight of expectations. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. "I can't," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," he said, his tone unwavering. I stepped back, shaking my head. "Damien, this has to stop. Whatever this is, it's not right." "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "Or are you just telling yourself that because it's easier than facing the truth?" His words struck a nerve, and I turned away, unable to look at him any longer. "I think you should go," I said, my voice barely audible. For a moment I thought he might argue, but instead he stepped back. "Fine," he said, his tone softening. "But this isn't over, Ellie. Not for me." The days that followed were a blur. Damien made himself scarce, spending most of his time out of the house or locked in his room. Richard, oblivious as ever, went about his routine, never once questioning the shift in the air between us. I threw myself into distractions, cleaning, gardening, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of Damien's words or the way they'd settled deep in my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Then, one evening, I found an envelope on the kitchen counter. My name was written on the front in Damien's familiar scrawl. I opened it with trembling hands, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. Ellie, I meant what I said. You deserve to be happy. And if that means walking away, I'll do it. But if you ever change your mind, I'll be waiting. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and unwelcome. I clutched the letter to my chest, the enormity of his words washing over me. In the end, I made my choice. I stayed. It wasn't because I didn't care about Damien. I did, more than I was willing to admit even to myself. But the weight of everything else, the promises I'd made, the life I'd built, it was too much to walk away from. Richard never noticed the change in me, or if he did, he never said anything. He went about his life as if nothing had happened, as if the ground beneath our feet hadn't shifted in ways he couldn't see. And Damien? He kept his promise. He walked away, but not entirely. There were still moments, fleeting glances, accidental touches, words left unsaid. But we both knew the line had been drawn, and crossing it again would mean losing everything. So we stayed on opposite sides of it, tethered by a bond we couldn't break but dared not name. And though I tried to tell myself it was enough, a part of me knew it never would be. I wasn't expecting him to walk in, let alone catch me like that. But the moment our eyes met, something shifted. And there was no going back. My name is Sophia. I'm 45, a creative director at a boutique interior design firm that caters to high-end clients. My job is demanding but rewarding, giving me a sense of purpose I don't always feel at home. My husband David is 50 and a successful attorney. He works long hours, often traveling for cases, and when he's home, he's distant, always tired or distracted by his phone or laptop. We've been married for nearly 10 years, and while it started out as a whirlwind romance, the spark fizzled out long ago. I don't blame him entirely. Life has a way of dulling even the brightest flames, especially when two people stop trying. This summer, Ryan, David's son from his first marriage, moved back in with us. He's 23, fresh out of college, and taking some time to figure out his next steps. When David suggested Ryan stay with us to save money, I didn't think much of it. In fact, I barely knew him. He'd spent most of his teenage years with his mother, visiting us only on holidays. But when he walked through the door with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, I barely recognized him. The awkward teenager I remembered had grown into a confident young man, tall, fit, with an easy smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, and while I tried not to notice, it was impossible not to. The day it all started was just like any other. David was at work, as usual, and I had come home early after a long meeting. I was changing out of my work clothes in the bedroom, thinking I had the house to myself. The door wasn't locked, I hadn't even thought to lock it, and just as I pulled my blouse over my head, the door swung open. Ryan stood there, frozen in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of me. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, quickly turning his back. I grabbed the first thing I could find to cover myself, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's fine. I thought you were out," I managed to say, trying to sound casual, despite the heat rushing to my face. He mumbled an apology and disappeared down the hallway, leaving the door ajar. For a moment I just stood there, clutching the fabric to my chest, replaying the look on his face. It wasn't just shock I saw in his eyes. It was something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. About the way he looked at me. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. Something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. After Ryan walked in on me that day, I tried to convince myself it was just an awkward moment. An innocent mistake that we'd both moved past. But something about it lingered. Every time I replayed the scene in my mind, I remembered the way his eyes had widened, the brief moment before he turned away, the flush of his face. For the first day or two I avoided him. Not intentionally, but I found myself keeping busy. Working longer hours, taking calls in my office, or retreating to the bedroom early. It wasn't that I thought he'd bring it up. Ryan didn't strike me as the confrontational type. But I couldn't shake the feeling of how exposed I'd felt, how vulnerable. And yet, there was another part of me, a quiet, insistent voice, that felt something else entirely. The thrill of being seen. A few days later, the tension between us broke through in the smallest of ways. It was late in the afternoon, and I was in the kitchen making iced tea. David had called to let me know he'd be late, as usual, and Ryan had just gotten back from the gym. I heard him before I saw him. The heavy thud of his sneakers on the hardwood floor. He walked into the kitchen shirtless, a towel slung around his neck, his hair damp with sweat. I glanced up from the counter and immediately regretted it. His broad shoulders and defined chest were impossible to ignore. "Hey," he said casually, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. "That smells good." "Iced tea," I replied, focusing intently on pouring it into the pitcher. "Mind if I have some?" "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I handed him a glass. He stood close, too close, as he poured himself a drink. I could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the faint scent of cologne and sweat lingering in the air. "About the other day," he started, his tone cautious. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced up at him, my fingers tightening around the counter's edge. "Ryan, it's fine. Really. I didn't mean to walk in like that," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I wasn't thinking." "It was an accident," I said quickly, hoping to put the conversation to rest. But he didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my stomach flip. "You look really nice that day, by the way," he said softly, almost as an afterthought. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Ryan, I'm sorry," he said, shaking his head and stepping back. "I shouldn't have said that." He turned and walked out of the kitchen before I could say another word, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The way he'd said it, soft, almost reverent, like it wasn't just an apology, but a confession. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing. The next morning, things felt almost normal again. Ryan was back to his easygoing self, cracking jokes at breakfast and acting as if nothing had happened. But I felt it, the subtle shift in the air between us, the stolen glances, the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me the sugar, the faint smile that lingered on his lips when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself it was nothing, just a product of my overactive imagination. But that changed one quiet evening when David was working late again. I was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, half watching a romantic drama on TV. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I thought I was alone until Ryan walked in. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, motioning to the other end of the couch. "Of course not," I said, my voice betraying the nervous flutter in my chest. He sat down, his presence immediately filling the room. For a while, we watched the movie in silence, the only sound the occasional clink of my glass on the coffee table. "What's this about?" he asked, gesturing to the screen. "Just a love story," I said with a shrug. "Nothing special." "Looks intense," he said, leaning back and stretching his arm along the back of the couch. His hand was close, so close, I could feel the warmth of it against my shoulder. I nodded, pretending to focus on the screen, but I was acutely aware of every movement he made. The way his knee brushed against mine when he shifted. The way his breath hitched slightly when he glanced at me out of the corner of his eye. And then it happened. I don't know who moved first, if it was him or me, but suddenly, our faces were inches apart. My heart raced as his eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. "Sophia?" he whispered, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't quite place. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But instead, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. His lips were soft and warm, and the kiss was slow, tentative, like we were both testing the waters of something forbidden. My hands trembled as they found their way to his shoulders, and his fingers brushed against my jaw, sending shivers down my spine. The kiss deepened, and for a moment I let myself get lost in it. In him. In the way he made me feel, alive, wanted, desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. But then reality came crashing down around me, and I pulled away, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. We can't," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine, "but I don't want to stop." Neither did I. After that kiss, everything changed. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a decision, but something unspoken had shifted between us. Ryan and I didn't talk about it the next day, or the day after that, but the tension lingered in every glance, every word, every room we happened to share. I tried to convince myself it was just one impulsive moment, a mistake that we could both quietly forget. But the truth was, I didn't want to forget it. I didn't want to stop feeling the way I had when his lips met mine, when his touch made me come alive again. The first real test came one afternoon, a few days later. I had taken the day off work to catch up on some errands, and when I got back to the house, I found Ryan in the kitchen. He was standing by the stove, flipping through a recipe book, with the faint sound of music playing from his phone. "Cooking something?" I asked, setting my keys down on the counter. "Trying to," he said with a grin, holding up a bowl of chopped vegetables. "Thought I'd surprise you and Dad with dinner tonight. Figured it's the least I can do since I'm living here rent-free." "That's sweet," I said, smiling despite the way my heart skipped a beat. He turned back to the stove, stirring something in a pan, and I couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed. How natural it felt to see him there, as if he belonged. "Want a taste?" he asked, holding out a spoon. I stepped closer, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened as I leaned in. The spoon hovered in front of my lips, and when I tasted the food, I was surprised by how good it was. "Not bad," I said, licking my lips. Ryan's eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long. "Glad you approve," he said, his voice soft. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something neither of us was willing to name. I stepped back, breaking the spell. "Well, let me know if you need any help." I left the kitchen quickly, but my hands were trembling by the time I reached the living room. Over the next week, these moments became more frequent. They weren't planned, but they weren't entirely accidental either. It was the way his hand brushed against mine when he passed me a dish at dinner, or the way he stood just a little too close when we were doing the dishes. It was the way his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. And then, one night, we crossed another line. David had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at the office, and I was sitting on the couch with a book. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner, and I thought I was alone until I heard footsteps on the stairs. Ryan appeared in the doorway, wearing a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt that clung to his chest in a way that made it impossible not to notice. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "Not really," he said, walking over to the couch. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not." He sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. For a while we didn't say anything, and I tried to focus on the book in my hands. But I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze making my skin tingle. "What are you reading?" he asked, breaking the silence. I held up the book so he could see the cover. "Just a mystery novel. Nothing exciting." "Looks good," he said, leaning in slightly to get a closer look. His arm brushed against mine, and I felt my breath hitch. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly he reached out and took the book from my hands, setting it on the coffee table. "Ryan." I started, but he silenced me with a look. His hand found mine, his fingers warm and steady as they closed around mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I should pull away, but I couldn't. Instead, I let him take my hand, let him draw me closer until our faces were just inches apart. And then he kissed me. This time it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was deep and urgent, filled with all the things we hadn't said. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. We didn't stop until we heard a noise from upstairs, a faint creak that sent a jolt of panic through both of us. "I should go," he said, his voice hushed as he pulled back. I nodded, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "Good night," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Good night," he said, and then he was gone, leaving me alone on the couch, with my heart racing and my mind spinning. The next day I told myself it had to stop, but as much as I wanted to believe that, I knew it wasn't true. The way Ryan made me feel, the way he looked at me, touched me, it was something I couldn't ignore. The moments between us became bolder after that. One afternoon I was in my office, working on a presentation for an upcoming client meeting. The door was slightly ajar, and I didn't hear him come in until he was standing right behind me. "Working hard?" he asked, his voice low. I jumped, turning to look at him. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said with a grin, leaning against the desk. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," I said, closing my laptop. "What's up?" Just wanted to see you, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Ryan, we can't keep doing this. Why not? He asked, stepping closer. It's not like anyone knows. That doesn't make it right, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Because I didn't want him to stop. It wasn't long before we found ourselves seeking out more moments like that. Small windows of time when we could be alone together, away from the watchful eyes of the world. In the kitchen late at night, when the rest of the house was asleep. In the backyard by the pool, where the warm summer air felt like a cocoon around us. In my office during the middle of the day, when I was supposed to be working. Every time, the line between us blurred a little more, and every time, the risk of being caught only made it more thrilling. The more time Ryan and I spent together, the less control I felt I had. Every passing day, the boundary between us grew thinner until it felt almost invisible. What started as fleeting moments, stolen glances, accidental touches, quickly became intentional. I stopped telling myself it was a mistake. I stopped pretending it was something I could just walk away from. I knew it was wrong, but the way he made me feel, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt alive again, and I didn't want to let that go no matter the cost. One evening, David was called away unexpectedly for an overnight deposition in another city. The moment he walked out the door, the house felt quieter, the tension sharper. Ryan was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch with a beer in hand. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes tracking my every move. You look nice, he said, his tone casual, but his gaze anything but. Thanks, I replied, sitting down in the armchair across from him. I was wearing a simple sundress, something light and comfortable for the warm evening, but the way he looked at me made it feel like I was wearing nothing at all. For a while, we made small talk, the kind of mundane conversation that would seem normal to anyone looking in from the outside. But beneath it, the tension simmered, unspoken but undeniable. At some point, the conversation lulled, and the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I glanced at him, and when our eyes met, I knew neither of us was thinking about the weather or the news or anything else we'd been pretending to care about. Without a word, he stood and walked over to me. Sophia, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, my breath hitching in my chest. We shouldn't. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. Tell me to stop, he said, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. His hands slid up my thighs, slow and deliberate, and before I knew it, he was pulling me to my feet. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body alight with anticipation as he guided me to the couch. That night, we didn't hold back. With David gone and the house to ourselves, we gave in completely, the weight of what we were doing eclipsed by the sheer intensity of it. Every kiss, every touch felt electric, like we were breaking through some invisible barrier that had been holding us back. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The house was quiet, and for a moment I let myself forget everything. Who I was, where I was, what I'd done. But when I turned over and saw Ryan still asleep beside me, reality came crashing back. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded into the kitchen. As I stood there staring out the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, the weight of my actions settled over me. I knew I should feel guilty, and I did. Partially. But more than that, I felt alive. For the first time in years, I felt desired, seen, and understood in a way David hadn't made me feel in a long time. But I also knew this couldn't last. We tried to be careful after that. We tried to limit our encounters to times and places where we wouldn't be caught. But the thrill of it, the constant risk of discovery, only made it more intoxicating. One afternoon, I was working in my home office, the door slightly ajar. I had a conference call in 20 minutes, and I was reviewing some notes when Ryan appeared in the doorway. Busy? He asked, his voice low. Always, I replied, glancing up at him. What do you need? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sending a shiver down my spine. Ryan? He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hands on my shoulders as he spun my chair to face him. You've been avoiding me, he said, his tone teasing but firm. I've been working, I said, my voice trembling. You work too much, he replied, his fingers trailing down my arms. I should have stopped him. I should have pushed him away. But instead, I let him pull me to my feet, his lips crashing against mine with an urgency that made my head spin. The desk rattled as he lifted me onto it, his hands sliding up my thighs as my papers scattered to the floor. For a moment, I forgot everything, my work, my husband, the life I was supposed to be living. All I could think about was him. Our recklessness nearly cost us everything one evening, just a few weeks later. David had gone out for a late dinner with colleagues, and I thought we'd have the house to ourselves for hours. Ryan and I were in the kitchen, laughing quietly as we shared a bottle of wine. I don't even remember what we were talking about. It didn't matter. At some point, he leaned in, his hand brushing against mine. I looked up at him, and before I knew it, we were kissing, the wine forgotten on the counter as he pressed me against the fridge. Neither of us heard the front door open. Sophia? David's voice rang out from the foyer. I pushed Ryan away so quickly I almost stumbled, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. In here, I called, my voice strained. Ryan stepped back, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face flushed. David walked into the kitchen a moment later, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. What's going on? He asked, his gaze shifting between us. Nothing, I said quickly, forcing a smile. We were just catching up. David didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he grabbed a glass of water and headed upstairs, leaving me alone with Ryan. That was close, I whispered once David was out of earshot. Too close, Ryan agreed, his voice low. But even as we stood there, the tension between us unbroken, I knew this wasn't over. The closer we came to being caught, the harder it became to stop. The danger only added fuel to the fire, making every touch, every kiss feel more urgent, more necessary. And yet, deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around us. I thought I had control of the situation. I told myself I could balance the two worlds, being a wife to David and whatever it was that Ryan and I had become. I told myself I could keep it from spiraling out of control. But the truth was, the more time I spent with Ryan, the harder it became to reconcile what we were doing with the life I'd built. I could feel the walls closing in, the guilt gnawing at me every time David looked at me with even a glimmer of affection. And yet, when I was with Ryan, none of that mattered. One evening, a few days after the close call in the kitchen, I found myself alone in the backyard. The sun had just set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the warm summer air felt heavy against my skin. I had a glass of wine in my hand, the kind of quiet moment I usually cherished. But tonight, my mind was anything but quiet. I didn't hear Ryan come outside until he was right behind me. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I turned to face him, my heart fluttering at the sight of him. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy, and he looked so effortlessly handsome it almost hurt to look at him. I'm fine, I said, though my voice betrayed the lie. You don't look fine, he said, stepping closer. You've been distant. I let out a shaky laugh, taking a sip of my wine to steady myself. What do you want me to say, Ryan? That this is easy for me? That I don't feel like I'm losing my mind? His brow furrowed, and he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. Sophia? No, I said, pulling away. You don't get to make this sound simple. It's not simple. It's messy and complicated and wrong and... It doesn't feel wrong, he interrupted, his voice firm. I stared at him, my chest tightening. It should, I whispered. But it doesn't, he said, stepping closer. Not when I'm with you. The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me. I turned away, setting my glass down on the table beside me. Ryan, whatever this is, it can't keep happening. Why not? He asked, his tone desperate. Because I can't live like this, I said, my voice cracking. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine, that I'm fine. I'm not. He was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unrelenting. I thought about it, about the nights we'd spent together, the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. No, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't regret it. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to cup my face. Then why are you trying so hard to push me away? Because it's going to destroy us, I said, tears stinging my eyes. Later that night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as David slept soundly beside me. I felt trapped, caught between the life I was supposed to have and the life I wanted. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the desire. I thought about Ryan, about the way he'd looked at me earlier, the way his voice had trembled when he asked if I regretted it. I didn't, and that terrified me more than anything else. The next day, I tried to distance myself from Ryan. I avoided being alone with him, threw myself into work, and spent as little time at home as possible. But it didn't matter how far I ran, he was always there, in the back of my mind, a constant, irresistible pull. It all came to a head one evening when David was working late again. I was in the living room, going over some paperwork, when Ryan walked in. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. I looked up at him, my chest tightening. "Ryan, I can't. You can't keep avoiding me," he said, cutting me off. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're trying to run from this, from us, but it's not working." "I'm trying to protect us," I said, my voice rising. "From what?" he demanded. "From feeling something real for once? From being happy? From ruining everything?" I snapped, standing up. "Ryan, this isn't a fairy tale. This is real life, and real life has consequences." "And what about what I feel?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What about what you feel? Are you just going to ignore it, pretend it doesn't matter?" I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want me to say, Ryan? That I want you? That I think about you every second of every day? That I can't stop?" "Yes," he said, his voice firm, "because it's the truth." Tears filled my eyes and I shook my head. "It doesn't matter. Wanting something doesn't make it right. But it doesn't make it wrong either," he said, stepping closer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, charged with everything we couldn't say. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "Tell me you don't feel the same way," he whispered. "Tell me, and I'll walk away." I couldn't. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender. For a moment, the world fell away, and all that mattered was him. When it was over, we sat together on the couch, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. "I don't know what to do," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said, his hand closing over mine. His confidence should have comforted me, but instead, it filled me with dread. Because deep down, I knew the truth. We were walking a dangerous line, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who could live with this level of deceit. Before Ryan, I'd always believed I was strong, disciplined, and unwavering in my commitments. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I realized that the person I thought I was, the version of me that David married, was someone I'd long since left behind. The worst part? I didn't feel like I'd lost myself. I felt like I'd found something I didn't know I was missing. A few nights after the conversation in the backyard, I stood at the bathroom sink, brushing my hair and staring at my reflection in the mirror. David was in the bedroom, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I looked at myself, trying to see the woman I used to be, the wife who loved her husband, the stepmother who never crossed a line. But all I could see was the way Ryan looked at me, the way he touched me, the way he made me feel like I was the center of the universe. The woman in the mirror wasn't conflicted. She wasn't filled with guilt or shame. She was selfish, and she knew it. It wasn't long before the cracks in my carefully constructed facade started to show. David began asking more questions. "You've been distracted lately," he said one morning over breakfast. "Work's been stressful," I replied, keeping my tone light. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The truth was, David wasn't stupid. He was a lawyer, after all, trained to notice inconsistencies, to pick apart stories and find the lies hidden in plain sight. And while he might not have known exactly what was going on, I could tell he sensed that something wasn't right. One evening, I was in my office, pretending to work on a project for a client. The house was quiet, David having gone to bed early after a long day. Ryan knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "You're up late," he said, closing the door behind him. "I could say the same about you," I replied, my heart racing as he walked over to my desk. He leaned against the edge, his hands resting on the polished wood. I wanted to see you. Ryan, I started, but he cut me off. I don't want to play this game anymore, he said, his voice low and intense. I can't keep pretending like I don't want you every second of every day. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I looked away, my hands trembling in my lap. You don't understand how complicated this is, I said softly. I do, he said, reaching out to lift my chin so I'd meet his gaze. But I don't care, I want you, Sophia, no matter what. I closed my eyes, my chest tightening. It's not that simple. It could be, he said, his voice steady, if you'd let it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything Ryan had said. I thought about what it would mean to leave David, to walk away from the life I'd built and start over. The idea terrified me, but the thought of losing Ryan terrified me even more. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. David had gone out to run errands, leaving Ryan and me alone in the house. I was in the kitchen, tidying up, when Ryan walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter, watching me. What is it? I asked, turning to face him. I can't keep doing this, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this, with hiding how I feel, he said, stepping closer. Ryan, we don't have a choice, I said, my voice trembling. Yes, we do, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. You just have to decide what you want. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. You're asking me to choose between you and my husband. I'm asking you to choose what makes you happy, he said. Because I can't keep living like this, wondering if every moment with you will be our last. Tears filled my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Ryan, this isn't just about us. There are consequences to what we're doing, consequences we can't ignore. I don't care about the consequences, he said, his voice breaking. I care about you. After he left the kitchen, I stood there for what felt like hours, replaying his words over and over in my mind. I knew he was right, about everything. I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between the life I'd built with David and the life I wanted with Ryan. But no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to make a decision. That night, I found myself sitting in my office, staring at a blank document on my laptop. I began to type, the words spilling out of me like a confession. It started with something so small, an accident, really. But it changed everything. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean to fall for him, but once I did, there was no going back. I poured everything into that document. Every emotion, every thought, every moment that had brought me to this point. It was raw and honest and messy. And when I finished, I sat back and stared at the words on the screen, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know if I had the strength to leave David, to start over with Ryan, to face the fallout of everything we'd done. But I knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, I couldn't go back to the way things were. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally ready to face it.